it is with absolute pleasure that I now invite Professor Garratt to deliver our opening keynote address.
Many thanks, Kamala, and many thanks to your committee for inviting me. I think this is the third time now I've opened. Maybe we should take a break next year and have someone else do it, but I'm delighted to be here. But I'm very sad that I shan't be at the gala. Sadly, that's because of an illness I have at this end, which is hopefully short term, but it won't be over by the time of the gala. So I shall have to drink my own rum. I was hoping to be able to drink Angosturas instead, but there you go. Yeah, the session around sustainability, circular economy takes me in a circle, because when I first started in architecture and architectural education, one of the things we were discussing at that time, and this I'm amazed to say is in the middle 1960s, was the idea of stable state economies and the idea of circular economies. So everything has a time and a cycle, and we seem to be recycling these old ideas that communities have a very particular need to look after themselves as well as look after the stakeholders. The theme I chose, therefore, was about resurrection, the recycling of entrepreneurship and of the board conscience. And on the entrepreneurship, despite President H.W. Bush, President George Bush, claiming that the French didn't have a word for entrepreneurship, it is actually French. And it means to undertake, to get going, to do something. And it refers particularly now to the owner of a business enterprise who, by risk and initiative, undertakes to create wealth. It could be social wealth, it could be financial wealth, but that's what they're trying to do. And those words, risk and initiative, are what I'm fighting against in various countries at the moment, where corporate governance has become much more a question of codes and regulations and little about the original entrepreneurship notion of creating a healthy organization. So I'm going to stress risk, I'm going to stress initiative, and the board's role as a stager of dramas. Now, at this point, can I ask Christy to put the slides on, please? Okay, so we go to the next one. And the next one. That's it. So the board's role as a stager of dramas. And I think the Caribbean has to be particularly proud yesterday of the amazing drama that was staged by Prime Minister Mia Mottley. Her speech was quite extraordinary, very dramatic, very well timed, very well placed, and it gave me hope that she was talking mainly about the islands, but not just the Caribbean islands, but it was very, very keen to ensure that their plight, their sustainability and their development was part of the wider COP development process. And I personally find that a wonderful context setter for the way in which this conference might develop and the way in which CCGI might develop in future. I was very impressed. So she was a person with vision and seems to be having impact through delivery. So well done, Mia Mottley. May I have the next slide, please? So I seem to have the international cold as well. In London at the moment, we're going through 10 days of storms, all coming up from your part of the world. So my lighting here may change dramatically. It's been very dark recently. Suddenly the sun's come out, so and it's pouring down with rain. So we're all snuffling a bit. But if we move beyond the idea of management, and most of us are brought up for most of our lives working in management and often as a single disciplinary professional. And that's fine, no problems with that at all. However, if you want to move into effective corporate governance, if you want to become a properly registered director, and I will argue move towards becoming a professional director, then the mindsets have to change. So we have to begin to drop, and this is quite painful for many people, the old operational disciplines like finance, manufacturing, marketing, HR, etc., which for the most part have a very single focus, and it's the executive team who then try to spot weld those together to make an effective organization. They are necessary, but they're not sufficient. The board has to exercise supervision over them, has to have oversight over their outputs, but the board is not meant to be management. That is their job. That's what you pay managers for. And it's realizing that we have to, if you like, get into our intellectual helicopter, rise above management, look out towards the horizon, and see all the complicated things that are going on. At the moment, it is very complex. And then as we try and make our any sense of that, we have to then balance three capitals. And whereas before we used to focus really only on financial capital, now, whether we like it or not, the public and many politicians in many countries around the world are insisting that we begin to take the context of environmental change and social change into our thinking as boards of directors. And that is quite a shock and actually quite uncomfortable for many people who have become directors, because suddenly you're into this list of how on earth do you monitor and make sensible decisions from very changing political world, very changing, fast-changing physical environmental issues, and COP27 is a classic of that, social changes, the technological environmental changes, and then the consequential trade flows, which are changing so fast. At the moment, the Ukrainian war has made that even more obvious at the moment. And many people I know who are existing directors or who are becoming directors right now are saying, we don't know how to cope. We have no idea how we can try and both ensure that we keep our sustainable business running and yet undertake giving direction to give it a healthy future. And these two elements of the basic of effective corporate governance, oversight of management and ensuring a healthy long-term future for the business are the bits that I will now concentrate on. So next slide, please. And we're moving into an area where ESG has become very prominent. We moved out of something that was called CSR, and that was meant to be a way in which we could look after our customers and our stakeholders in a more thoughtful, more helpful way. But that began to be seen over the last 10 years as something which was nearer whitewashing than really very serious. So ESG has emerged in its many ways from political parties, from NGOs, from governments, and is very much in the public mind at the moment. That back to the three capitals, we need to balance our financial outputs with the physical environment, the social environment, to give us effective corporate governance. And that's okay, that's great, that's it, but I don't think it's anywhere near enough. And this is where the demands are building now on getting clearer organizational purpose, business purpose, and having a conscience in relation to the way in which we deploy our scarce resources in the physical environment, in the social environment, and to achieve entrepreneurial ends. I notice some companies now are beginning to reintroduce in their memorandum and articles of association an objectives statement, which is why we're really here and what it is we're trying to do. I believe in the next few years, this will become pretty much mandatory. It's sort of dropped out just through non-use, but it will come back again. I have the next slide, please. And this is where the new mindsets come in. I've mentioned finance, environmental, social, all of them having impacts. And this word impact is becoming very big at the moment. And governance, notice governance competence. So impacts and competence are becoming quite large issues, in fact, very large issues. We're seeing a lot of development at the moment in the E area, in the environmental area, and COP27 today is a classic of its kind. We're beginning to see more interest in beginning to look at impact in the social areas. And if you read Mia Mottley's speech yesterday, you'll see that is very strong in that area. But we're not getting a lot of interest, a lot of in the G area, in the governance area. And I'll come later to suggest some of the reasons we see that. But our stakeholders in all their forms, from shareholder through employee, out into the community, into supply chain lines, into our customers, they're becoming more and more demanding, asking for more and more metrics, and therefore becoming pretty impossible for any board to avoid. So the time spent by the board looking at those competing demands is growing very rapidly indeed. But most people who become directors do it almost as a sideline. They don't have big budgets for the board or for their own development. They don't have time budgets for really serious board meetings, but more importantly, for doing the homework after or before board meetings, where you are doing that horizon scanning and looking at all those changes and doing that in a systematic manner. So we have a problem at the moment that we still have in the public's mind a notion that boards, for the most part, belong to quite large corporations, almost certainly private corporations, and they have unlimited size, unlimited life, unlimited license, and consequently unlimited power. And those notions were mentioned way back in 1776 by Adam Smith, and they are only just beginning to be seriously challenged by the public. And various countries now, and particularly some of the smaller nations, are beginning to say, no, that's not right for us. We need a different approach there. And that's being challenged. And again, Mia Mottley was very interested in that yesterday. So boards can't consider themselves apart from the community and politics. And I know still a large number of boards around the world that say we want nothing to do with politics. We're not part of that. Well, like it or not, politics are doing things to you. It's how you respond to that that is the big question. You don't have to become party political to do that, but you do need to be very, very clear as to what your purpose is, and then how your very scarce resources will be deployed to that, and whether the politicians particularly are helping or hindering your achievement of that purpose. So I'm saying that boards consciously design their own business's future. But I'm changing the model from a mechanical one to much more one of ecology, where a board and a company now exist within energy niches, given all these other pressures on them, and that for any length of time, they can survive quite happily within those energy niches. They're producing goods or services that people want, they're providing employment, they're becoming better and better at not abusing the environment, at developing communities, etc. And that's their ecological niche. But these niches do change, and often change quite rapidly. And having the board having a mindset of consciously designing the business's future all the time is a very important one. And we need both the time and the competence to be able to do that. So I don't know if you know the notion of Gaia. There was that wonderful photograph with the first moonshots of Earthrise, this fantastic picture of the earth rising instead of the sun rising. And that is part of the notion, the concept around which Gaia is built, that we live in a very fragile ecosystem. And at the moment, we're just about surviving in our ecological niche in that. But we really are going to have to take some fairly dramatic actions in the next 5 to 10 years to make sure we can sustain, back to sustainability, to sustain those ecological niches. And I'm arguing that we need the same sort of thinking for a board. How do we have our mini Gaia concept for each organization, each business, each charity, each private sector, each public sector organization, to ensure that they can either stay within or develop their ecological niches. And that begins to open up then, behind that, the notion of values, the notion of human duties, and particularly the other part of this, the conscience of the board. And I'll come on to that in a minute. So we are, whether we like it or not, particularly through social media, under constant public gaze. And a lot of boards don't like that, but they're not going to be able to get away from it. We now have to begin to talk about our values, our duties, our conscience as a normal part of board activity. May I have the next slide, please? So I've invented a little formula up the top there, which is ENT, which is enterprise, plus ENVI, that's environmental impact, plus SOC-I, which is social impact, equals effective corporate governance. And I'm experimenting in various organizations, various countries with trying to develop that. It's a work in progress. I'm not saying that's it, I have the formula, but it's the one I'm working on at the moment. It's the one that seems to be easily accepted by most people. So out go notions of, for example, shareholder supremacy. Really, we've been held in thrall for certainly 40 years by the Chicago economists and financiers and their whole focus on the supremacy of the shareholder, which I've always argued against, because shareholders are not supreme in a company in the sense that shareholders do not own a company. Nobody owns a company. A company is a separate legal entity, but shareholders do have rights, given the piece of paper they own, to select and deselect directors, to comment on, but not have power over. They cannot manage what happens in the board and around the operational side of the business. They can certainly comment on that. And in the end, the only other power they have really is to scoop up the residual assets of the business if it goes bust. So this notion of shareholder supremacy, I always argue, was a nonsense, because A, they didn't really own the business, and B, shareholders seem, particularly in the US, but not just in the US, to have a very, very low power base. That the real power was coming out of the chief executives, and that shareholder supremacy was just a cover for letting the chief executives get on and do whatever they liked. And I'm well known for arguing that and for publishing that. But out go as well the absolute financial supremacy. Yes, of course, an organization has to make a surplus or a profit, but it's not the be all and end all. Listed company focus, the listed company side in many countries now is beginning to diminish quite rapidly, and other forms of finance and other forms of accountability and, for example, different types of performance bonds, etc., are beginning to appear, which are way outside the role of most stock exchanges. Current accounting and audit practice is under enormous scrutiny, and I don't need to tell you in the Caribbean that, because there are horrendous cases that have gone on, a lot of them coming out of London, a lot of them coming out of money laundering. And those are, thank goodness, beginning to appear in court now. And also the notion of fund management, and particularly private equity, are now under great scrutiny. Fund management, because their performance has been lackluster, to say the least, over the last 4 or 5 years, generally. And they continue to use, for example, performance systems that are based on quarterly returns, and fund managers being rewarded on quarterly returns, which is nonsense, because proper fund management has to take a very long-term view. So that's in contradiction. And private equity similarly wanting to get in and get out very quickly, so often loading companies up with debt. We've had 3 cases of that in the last month here, and then it not quite working properly, and they wanted to get out in 4 years, but actually pulling out in 2 to 3 years and leaving wrecked companies. All of that is now highly suspect, and I would argue is not what effective corporate governance is going to focus on in the future. But in come the notions of stakeholder supremacy. A lot of nations now saying you have a limited license to operate for a number of years in our country, provided you obey the following rules. That, I think, is going to grow a lot. Increasingly now, we're beginning to see annual assessments of entrepreneurship, environmental, social impacts, and now governance. And we're beginning to see bonds beginning to appear in many, many places now. So environmental bonds, social impact bonds, and just beginning, but only just beginning, the concept of governance bonds, that if you actually are seen to be running an effective company for a few years, then your the rate at which you can get your finance is lowered, which is beginning to be quite a lot of talk going on about that at the moment. And these new forms are being integrated in new forms of accounting and audit. We're seeing, and CAMLA's run sessions on this already with Carolyn Chalmers in South Africa and Professor Mervyn King, the ISO 37000 system, which is a very interesting and well worth investigating system by which we might look at future accounting, audit, and disclosure. And Professor King is really pushing through the United Nations and elsewhere the globally accepted corporate governance reporting system, which does not exist at the moment, but a lot of people interested in seeing whether we could actually have a global way of reporting, disclosing, and audit. And behind all that, I would argue there's a generational shift going on. Again, CAMLA is ahead of her time, and she's had Peter Aylwin and others running a conference on future funding, not through the normal shareholder system, not through the normal stockholder system, not through IPOs, not through M&As, but particularly through very wealthy individuals, but especially through family offices who nowadays act typically as old style merchant banks, beginning to look at medium to long-term finance and taking much higher risk, but for higher return, to sustain their families and their family offices through a much more enlightened way of beginning to fund our futures. And this notion of the great wealth transfer, which Peter has talked about, and which CAMLA has the tapes on, or the videos on, as to how that might come about, or is in fact is already coming about. Those videos exist and are well worth having a look at. Can I have the next slide, please? I get very worked up about the current regulatory version of corporate governance, which I mentioned at the beginning. So I have grave doubts about many of the existing codes, many of the existing regulations. I like the idea of good practice, not best practice, because from good practice you can learn and change. From best practice you tend to get push, particularly by regulators, into trying to make it mandatory. So I'm very, very worried about those particular things. But the net effect of too much regulation is we lose faith in our human institutions. And our human institutions are a bit the cement that bonds our societies together. And if we begin to erode those, and we see this happening horribly, horribly at the moment in the US and with the elections today, it is very worrying to see the attacks from all sides on those human institutions that actually hold us together and the values that go behind them. So I put in there a quote from E.O. Wilson, which some of you will have seen before, that as we enter the 21st century, we have created a Star Wars civilization. This has Stone Age emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. We are terribly confused by the mere fact of our existence, and so a danger to ourselves and to others. And that's from his book, The Social Conquest of the Earth. And I do feel in that way, but one of the things I think corporate governance can do is really help us develop those medieval institutions. And that's the bit that I try and focus on. Can I have the next slide, please? But we've got to do some work on that. So we need to accept that directing, first of all, is a proper job, quite distinct from managing. That there's proper funding and development of a selection, induction, personal development, regular competence assessment, and deselection process from our boards, that it is accepted and funded as such. That we need individual contracts for services as a director, for every director, whether you're an executive who also has a directorial role or not. I argue in that case, you need two contracts of employment. One is the normal contract for employment as an employee, but the other, which may only be for 10 or 20% of your time at the most, is an individual contract for services as a director, which spells out the amount of time you're expected to, the rights and duties you have in there, spells out the developmental opportunities you have, but particularly stresses that you are a director, quite distinct from being a manager. Personal public commitments for each director is spelled out. The 7 duties of a board, which I have constantly talked about on these sessions, spelled out, and the purpose of a board, about which I've also talked about, and which nowadays, the purpose of a board, certainly in the common law countries under the 2006 Companies Act, spells out the need for a board to take into account not just its financial outputs, but the interests of the stakeholders, including the employees, the customers, the supply lines, and the community and the environment. So these things are coming along, and we're beginning to see integrated governance systems beginning to link directors, stakeholders, politicians, regulators together under public oversight. And one of the things I think will happen over the next decade is a lot more interest by the general public in understanding what the duties of a director are, what the purpose of a board and a company is, and there being a lot more spotlighting through public oversight of how effective they are. So the measurement of the competencies in doing that will develop and are already developing quite rapidly. And I would also argue, cheekily, that the same applies to the competencies of politicians, of civil servants, and the regulators themselves, because I'm constantly surprised, frankly, how little all of them know, even if they are regulators, what the rules are, what the duties are, what the purposes are behind that. It's very easy to move into the bureaucratic world and start making lists and say you must obey them. But to understand how the good practice has developed, why it's there, and what can be developed from that, rather than from fairly abstract regulations, is a very important issue. And therefore, to end it, that part, we need to agree assess levels of competence for directors. And that again is where I think CAMLA, the CCGI, Carolyn in South Africa, Peter Crow in New Zealand, the Australians, the folk at the Institute of Directors in London who've gone to sleep for about 10 years, but seem to be waking up again now, the folk in the Gulf through Jane Vowles and the Gulf Cooperation Council. All these are moving to begin to develop fairly sophisticated levels of assessment of competence for directors. And I will argue that over the next decade, these will begin to converge, and we might begin to see a generally accepted notion of what that is going to be about. May I have the next slide, please? Now, I put up there the duties of a director, which I know I've batted on about before, but it's that particularly the success of the company, which is the entrepreneurship, and then the tricky ones, exercising independent judgment and exercising reasonable care, skill, and diligence in being a director, which are the ones that are being developed around the competencies area. And it's really difficult because many people can't easily exercise their independent judgment because they've been put onto boards effectively as a nominee. It could be head office saying, become a director of a subsidiary company. It could be a government minister saying, sit on this board, and basically I will tell you what to do and you will report to me, etc., etc. All of those are unlawful. And it's very difficult for an individual director put in that position to report back, no, my independent judgment says I must do the following, again, to sustain the healthy future of the company. And that's something which we are going to have to support and develop through institutions like CCGI to actually have the personal courage, but also the backup law. We need help from the courts in this area to say, this is what the law says we are meant to be doing. May I have the next slide, please? So the book I'm working on at the moment is about 4 levels of board maturity. And what I'm arguing is that well over 90% of the directors all around the world are there by accident. They didn't necessarily want to be there. They have not, some of them do, but many of them didn't even realize they were. And I just am astonished in 40 years of consulting in the area, how many people come to me and say, either I'm being brought up before a court or I'm told that I might be brought up before a court and I didn't even know I was a director. And that is so common. It's just astonishing. And then if they begin to realize they are and they have signed up as a director formally, then they go to level 2, the grudgingly compliant board. I didn't want to be here. I don't want to do it. But I know legally I have to be compliant. So I will do as little as possible to in the director role. And I will continue in my professional role or my managerial role and complain bitterly that it's all a con and it's all dumped on me by unfeeling politicians and absolutely stupid regulators. And they get quite grudging in that area. It's when you begin to realize that, no, there is a proper job to be done, that you can begin to learn what that is. And the idea of the learning board, which was essentially what my book, the Fish Rots and the Head, was about, has become established in quite a number of countries and quite a number of organizations, public and private, around the world. So just a quick reminder of that. If I can have the next slide, please. So this is where we really are getting into our helicopter, trying to move for periods of time outside the world of management. And most of us are stuck in the bottom left-hand corner. We're meant to be supervising management as a director. So the focus there is on the short term and on the internal workings of the business. But frankly, that's where we've come from. And that's where we're often very, very comfortable indeed. So it takes a lot to get us away from that comfy bed. The ways of doing it then are manifest, and I'm not going to go into them now, but what we're trying to do is move to the top right-hand corner, where we're scanning continuously the horizon for all those changes going on in the technological, the political, the environmental, the social world, and then taking or forming our purpose and our policy in relation to that at the highest level of the board, and then taking that down from that external focus, long-term focus, into a shorter term, long-term focus, which is strategic thinking, which is basically saying, how on earth is it, given we have very, very scarce resources, and given there are so many changes going on in the outside world, how can we deliver our legal role in this? And that's what CCGI and others are now working on, I'm happy to say. As I say, most of us are stuck in the bottom left-hand corner and normally feeling reasonably comfortable about that. So again, how do you get in the helicopter and rise above trying to do that? Because one of the cardinal sins of a director is to try and manage the board, manage the management from the boardroom table. And that is just not on. That is not possible or wise. So how do we set up these systems? And there are plenty available by which we actually ensure the prudent control of the business without trying to interfere all the time. And then back, more externally orientated, but still very short term, is ensuring those accountabilities I mentioned before of the financial outputs, the environmental outputs, the social outputs, the governance outputs, and particularly the way in which we handle now disclosure and audit and our relationships to those. So that is a cycle that moves really from the top right-hand corner through strategic thinking on to supervisory management and up to ensuring accountability. And ensuring accountability then moves back into policy formulation again, making sure that we are on track to deliver our purpose. That's the basic learning board cycle. If I could have the next slide. And I'm not going to go through this in any detail. That's the same slide, but now it lists out all the things that need to be done. What I will point out in policy formulation is that monitoring that external environment, budgeting the time to read newspapers, watch the news, go to conferences, talk about what's happening, scan. The directorial role is 24/7. It's not only when you turn up to board meetings, it's a continuous learning cycle. And that arrowhead drives us down into how do we position then in those changing markets. And the arrowhead from strategic thinking into supervising management is deciding the implementation processes with the executives as to how we're going to do that. And then you've got all those ways of measuring, which are well known, that are listed under the supervising management side, and then back into the accountability and ensuring that those proper audits are done. So as I say, I'm not going to go into that, but notice that that is a cycle, and the hub of the cycle, the center of the cycle, is the business brain and the conscience of the board. And it's the value sets by which we make our judgments, by which we are careful and skillful and diligent in the way we take decisions, that is very, very conscience-based. And may I have a slide, please? So do watch the movements that are going on at the moment. There's growing public demand for the development of the board's conscience and its relationship to the environment, the social side, and effective governance. The consequential disclosure demands, which are coming through quite rapidly now, and inclusively very, very public disclosure demands, which many companies feel quite uncomfortable about. And that's not surprising because, for example, detailed ownership is a big issue. It's been a big issue in London and the Caribbean, particularly through money laundering, etc. And I'm still working in London to try and get the abandonment of the limited liability partnership legislation, which Tony Blair's government brought in, because it allowed people to not disclose the ultimate owners of businesses. And that, I think, is an absolute scandal and something we have to stop. The international demands for the accreditation of registered directors, so the competence directors, those are growing in many, many countries. And well done, CCGI, for pushing that. The generational shift we need to note, particularly in the attitudes to future funding, which I'm arguing will have very little relationship to present funding. And as I say, particularly through the way shareholding, stock exchanges, IPOs, M&As, and all the rest of it are handled at the moment. And the rise by the directors themselves for a full process of selection, induction, assessment, personal development, and deselection, and that we have the appropriate time and money budgets to achieve this. And then this notion of the rise of the board as a mini Gaia. So we are sitting within energy niches, ecological systems, and the board is there. And in the end, it all looks horribly complex and horribly messy and very, very difficult. And various people are saying, oh my God, what have I put my hand in when they get into a board? And what I'm suggesting is that one of the great strengths we all have is our naive intelligence. You don't get to a board without being intelligent, but you're often, and quite understandably, remarkably naive about a lot of the things that are happening outside. But if you and the other members of the board agree you're naively intelligent, then there are great things you can do as part of your normal living to actually build up your expertise in those areas. And that may be another talk that I give at some point. So I see the last slide. It's basically that's all, folks. Thanks for listening. Do note that no codes or regulations were used during the making of this presentation. It's actually about being a director. It's not about that. That's the company secretary's role to ensure compliance. The company secretary is the officer of the board. They have to make sure we're within the rules. But it's our job to get on delivering sustainability, delivering the purpose, doing it through the duties, doing it through our values. And the key thing for me is and enjoying ourselves, because being on a board, as far as I'm concerned, is very stretching intellectually and emotionally, but it's also great fun. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Garratt. That was such an amazing, awesome opening keynote this morning. So I know persons who would have been listening avidly. So I just want to go through 2 or 3 key points to highlight some of the main contributions which you shared with us this morning. And of course, started with the board's fundamental role in terms of oversight and not management, because as you say, that is what management is paid to do. And the move towards the 3 capitals now, finance, environment, and social, and not just finance, as has been the status quo in the past. And of course, going through the fact that there is a lot of focus now on environmental and social issues. But as you said, there really hasn't been the same level of focus on the governance side of it. And also speaking to the importance of developing some new, what you termed necessary mindsets in terms of entrepreneurship, environment, and social, and especially the fact that this stakeholder supremacy model is going to have such a long-term impact in the way we think and the way we govern, particularly because organizations would now no longer have that unlimited license to operate using the resources from society. And also the fact that a lot of the changes are really being driven by the new generation, many of whom are funding some of these changes that we want through family offices. And your expectations and hope that we can, in fact, develop a lot of our institutions away from what was described by Mr. Wilson as medieval institutions, that in fact these moves can help us in this way. But significantly, and I thought an really important part of your contribution today was on this notion of having contracts for directors. And in fact, what would even be contained in those contracts, picking up, for instance, how much time it is expected that a director should spend with a specific board, then what are the development opportunities for they themselves to grow and understand their role for that board, understanding their duties and responsibilities as a director. Also, agreeing on the levels of competence that would be required and the kind of evaluation which will take place to ensure that directors are contributing as expected. So that is an area that I'd want us to explore a little bit as we move into this Q&A segment. And of course, I loved the 4 levels of maturity, which you described to us again. The accidental directors, the grudgingly compliant, the learning board, and then the professional board. And for me, I think I really learned a lot listening to you as you brought it all together to speak to where exactly are we stuck. And it is really clear, as you said it, I'm seeing it that as directors, most of the time is really spent in supervising the management. When in fact, if we use the skill and competence of directors, then the majority of that time is really meant to be spent scanning the external environment, understanding the challenges that's going to impact the organization, and therefore focusing on the long-term policy developments that's going to help steer that organization for long-term success. And of course, the fact that you reiterated, at the end of the day, really being a director is a 24-hour commitment. It is constant attendance to being able to see and understand the changes and implications and impact that is having. And also to noting that directors themselves are also asking and demanding that there be some changes, because they too are calling for greater levels of induction, greater levels of personal development and understanding of the director assessment and the whole deselection process as well. And then also reminding us that possibly one of the major strengths that we all have, if we can understand how to use it, is the notion of the naive intelligence, which is where we really ought to put aside all of what we think we know and then really kind of question everything again so that we see it from a very new a perspective, to understand it through the eyes of someone who is probably hearing this for the first time, to understand if what we have been doing and thinking, if that is really leading to the results that we want. So really, really an awesome contribution this morning, Professor Garratt. So I want to advise everyone, we are going to open now to our Q&A time. And if persons have questions or comments, please feel free to raise your virtual hand, as I would have said earlier, or you can, in fact, put a comment in the chat feature so we can see it. I know that we have a number of persons here who would have been listening avidly, and I'm sure have some questions as well. So I want to start the ball rolling by focusing on an area that I find to be really intriguing, Professor Garratt. And Crystal, I did see your hand go up, so I'm going to come to you next. But I want to ask Professor Garratt, the idea of a contract for a director. How do we work on understanding what are the elements that should be picked up on that, and who is the contract really to be signed with? Is the director signing with the organization? Is this a contract with the directors and the owners? Who exactly you would say in order that this may be an effective move forward?
Well, the contract is a legal document between the director and the company as a separate legal entity.
Right.
So that I think is pretty clear, or should be pretty clear. It's not clear in many directors' minds, and it should just specify that. I mean, the simplest way I've seen it done is for them to say, list the 7 duties of a director and the 5 elements of the purpose of a board, to say this is what you are meant to be. These are your duties. These are what you're meant to be delivering, without going into any details, but just saying these are already under common law 2 legal elements which are well tested at law. That is what you're meant to be doing. And then in the contract, you spell out whether there is any reward or not, financial or otherwise. And many people, even in private companies, will do some directorial work pro bono, but obviously with the vast growth in charities and such like, that needs to be very, very clear indeed. And I argue very strongly there should be a time budget in there, that you will be expected to spend an amount of time in board meetings or committee meetings. By the way, I hate committee meetings, but anyway, that's a separate issue. But in board meetings, and a certain amount of time doing your homework, doing the horizon scanning. And now there are various techniques for doing that, but that's not in the contract. So the contract most probably is only 2 pages, but it's very important to have it, because then psychologically people can think to themselves, as I go into the boardroom, I change my hat. And I now put on a director's hat. And and we're all doing the same around the boardroom table. And so we have to get in our helicopter, rise up above, and think very much about how are we going to sustain the future of this organization. And that does actually have an emotional drive to it, but it also has an intellectual drive to it as well. And when we've done that, although it may seem silly, when you first see it and you first do it, I find that it actually gives people a lot of confidence to try and then move towards directorial competence.
Very good. Thank you. And it certainly, I think, it can have a major impact in that way. I'm happy too that you have emphasized that it's a contract with the company, because when you think about it generally, it is the shareholders who appoint directors, and therefore they can be forgiven for thinking, well, the contract then is with them. Right? So it's for the long-term interest of the company, and it's a contract with the company in the form of its separate nature as a legal entity on its own, able to contract with.
As an aside, this is not strictly the contractual side, but sometimes when I'm developing a board, if they are very much in the grumpily compliant mode, I will add a separate chair around the boardroom table and say this chair represents the company as a legal personality. And when we're discussing things, you have to address that chair to explain what your proposition is and what your values are around it. Now, some people find that really weird. Some people find it very mechanical, but most people seem to get something out of it in the first couple of times because they suddenly realize they're not trying to address their nominees. They're trying to address the company issues.
Yes. Okay. Very good. Crystal has had her hand up for a while, so I want to go to her first, and then we'll go to Ulrich as well, right? So, Crystal.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Good morning,
Hi,
Professor.
Crystal.
So I find your perspective interesting with respect to the regulatorily required corporate governance obligations. It's something that I kind of agreed. I kind of agree with. So my question is, and I will give the context after I state the question.
Well, may I just ask you if you would like to put on your video so we could include you in the panel frame as well, so that we can capture your question properly. Excellent. All right. So
no problem. So my question, Professor, thank you so much for your presentation. How do we support boards, or how do we help boards balance that regulatory corporate governance requirement alongside the board's desire, possibly, to develop their corporate governance in a way that they deem fit? So whether they want to move from the basic board, the learning board, the professional board. So, and this is my context. We're in a global economy, of course. So we have, in some instances, for example, with our entity, we have several regulators, several, right? And they each have their own guideline, their own framework that they would like us to follow. Yes. Although they are by and large the same, there are some minor nuances in there. And so it's easy for the board to get caught up in trying to stay abreast of all these corporate governance requirements. And it's a requirement because it's moving from, although they say guidance, it becomes, when you get audited and they come back and they ask you annual questionnaires. So we have boards in a position where they have to balance these regulatory requirements alongside what they think is the direction that what is best for the company and the corporate governance culture that is best for the company. How do we help our boards move from just, because it could become overwhelming, of course.
May I ask one question before I respond? Which is, are you in financial services?
I am.
It shows. Because, I mean, you have really do have my sympathy. Because I think a big problem we have is that financial services were seen to behave so badly back in 2007, 2008, that they have not been forgiven. And therefore, different regulators were brought into play, and they, as you rightly say, do not all have the same script. And so we're having to be compliant with a whole series of things. And a lot of the things they brought into play, to be honest, not just the financial ones, they did not understand, but they used buzzwords, fashionable phrases like executive director and non-executive director. And then in financial services, that became more complicated as you had to be accredited or and so on and so forth. And most of that, frankly, is a nonsense because it's covered very simply in company law if you are registered as a director. But they've made it unbelievably complex. And I despair with quite a lot of financial services companies I deal with, because I'm telling them that, I'm most probably going to spend a fortune, or they will spend a fortune on me before we even get to where we want to be, because we've got to get rid of so much of the undergrowth. And it's a big issue. The way in which no, let me go back. I mentioned last time I was on air here that I'd been twice to the Houses of Parliament in the UK. And on both of those occasions, when I was asked to give short talks on the way corporate governance was developing, I began, and my audience was mainly 100 members of Parliament or members of the House of Lords who had expressed a particular interest in corporate governance. So I began each talk by asking a very simple question. How many people in this room can list 3 of the 7 duties of a director? And the answer was no one. Now, this is why I have a problem with regulators, because I've done similar things with regulators. A few of them, particularly if they're company secretaries, can actually make the list, but most of the regulators that I know cannot. And that's a real problem. This is where the public needs to be better informed. So I try and work outside the regulatory system on getting the public to ask the really good questions and do it consistently. Because if they do that, then the regulators begin to have to row back a bit and not add more and more to the regulations, but actually go back to, in our case, Section 171 on duties, Section 172 on the purpose of a board, and begin to work from there. I think in some ways it's incredibly easy, but actually getting the people in power to understand the complexities that they often quite unwittingly have developed for themselves becomes a major, major task. And it's an unnecessary task. It's worse in the States in the sense that, because although we have common law, the way in which the Europeans and many of the Asians have developed common law is to have a principle-based approach so that you know what the basics are, you are meant to stay within them. If you do not stay within them, then the principle is that you can explain, so comply and explain, or explain why it is. And then it's up to the shareholders to decide whether they like that or not. Now, in the US, it doesn't work like that. You still have common law base, but you have a rules-based approach. So you try and write as many rules as you can to stop people doing as much as naughty things that they can. And the problem with that approach is you just keep on having to add rules because people get naughtier and naughtier. It's really quite, so, I know various US corporate lawyers who make a fortune by being right up to date, and every time a new rule comes out, they've worked out ways around it, and they sell those. Now that to me is a complete travesty, and it's not a system. But because of that, and because many parts of the world, including the UK, think the US are wonderful, they tend to copy. And I think the US is a basket case in terms of corporate governance. I really, really do. And that's because their federal system is almost non-existent. So their federal system really recently has only produced Sarbanes-Oxley, which is a very rules-based activity. And what they've done, what the national politicians have done, have not developed corporate governance as a national strength, but they've let the states do it themselves. And hence you get these very different and sometimes very weird state laws appearing. And we all know that Delaware is the go-to place for most US corporations because it has the most business-friendly laws, which especially in the corporate governance area. And I've spoken with the Chancery Court of Delaware about this, and they say, look, Bob, you're absolutely right, but Delaware is a small state, doesn't have much natural resources. We can't charge high taxes, and therefore we make our money out of running business-friendly laws, which is very honest. but it doesn't help us trying to get better corporate governance. So that's a bit of a circular response to your question, but you have my sympathy, and I, at the moment, still don't know how I can get the financial people to realize what they're doing. But even they complain, but they don't quite seem to realize what it is they've actually done.
Okay, thank you very much. And let me ask Ulrich now if he can put on his video and join us in asking his question or making a comment. So,
Kamla, good morning.
Hi, Ulrich.
Good morning, Kamla. Please let me beg your indulgence not to put on the video because we've had some inclement weather here in Couva, and so my internet is a little bit flaky.
Understood.
So please, Kamla. Right. So good morning, Kamla, and good morning, Professor.
Hi.
Good morning to all the attendees. Let me caveat my question by saying that I came in a little bit late, so I didn't catch all of the professor's comments or perspectives. However, I understood, and I'm going to use my own terminology as far as a few of these things. I'm going to speak to the operational directorship, and I think operational directorship is one where you're in the supervisory mode, you're supervising management, and you're looking more at compliance, and deal with what I gather the professor was trying to guide us in, which I call strategic directorship.
Yes.
Strategic directorship, looking at really where the organization is going and its impact on some of the issues around governance and the environment, etc., which are new kids on the block, so to speak. But my question really is, how do you juxtapose, Professor, that strategic directorship against strategic management / strategic leadership, which tends to be the domain of management? And how do you juxtapose that? Because sometimes the lines get very blurred in that conversation. And so you find yourself coming up against a team of management who believe that this is not really what you're there for, and so how do you juxtapose that? How do you fit that within structure, within some kind of relationship that allows synergies to take place and allows the best for the organization to evolve? Thank you.
I think the simple answer to that is, how do I do it? With difficulty, because it's such a common problem. But the more complex answer is actually to start again back at basics. That in common law, a director is a director, full stop. There is no adjective to describe it. You are either a director or you're not. And at the beginning of the law, it says, if you use the term director, if you hold yourself out to be a director, or you pose as a director, then you have all the responsibilities and liabilities of someone who is registered as a director. So I start from the idea that a director is a director. And if you want to put the term executive or non-executive or operational or strategic or whatever in front of it, that doesn't stop you being a director. You still are jointly and severally, particularly severally, liable for the activities taken by the board, the actions taken by the board. And that means that if you're going to restrict yourself only to the operational side, you're still liable for everything that happens on the strategic side, and vice versa. If you're only going to focus on the strategic side, you're still liable for the actions for ensuring prudent control of the operations side of the business. But many people don't see it that way, even though that's the legal position, and they tend to behave as though they're two very distinct activities. As I said with the little drawing, trying to move people who are legally directors to spend more of their time away from the bottom left-hand corner and moving up towards the top right-hand corner is, my life's work, really. That's what I try and do. And it's not to say that the bottom left-hand corner isn't important. It is. But if you're a director, you're trying to do, if we go back again, something I've spoken of before, to the meaning of the word governance. It comes from the Old Greek kubernetes and goes into Latin as gubernetes, and then into French as gouvernance, and then into English as governance. And that takes three millennia to do. So it's been around an awful long time. But the basics of it, of Kubernetes, was the person who steered a ship. And the whole idea of being a director is to give direction, to show a way ahead. And the interesting bit to me was that the same word, Kubernetes, evolves very slowly and really below the horizon over those 3 millennia into a very modern term. So Kubernetes becomes cybernetics, and that's about control systems and the prudent controls. And so if you put the two together, you've got steering the way ahead and ensuring prudent control as the essence of direction giving. Now, I have no problems if some people are much more orientated towards the operational world and some much more towards the strategic world, provided they understand that they are both liable for what they're doing as a director. It's different for executives because executives have actually surprisingly little law that binds them. One of the oddities about being a director is how much law there is that actually says what you must do. Very little of that exists in the executive world. And executives tend to be the most active people in the company. So unless you're ensuring that they're actually developing prudent controls and you're supervising that, they tend to rush off and do all sorts of things. I mean, the most classic case I ever came across was a Metallgesellschaft in Germany back in the 80s, where they had a new board. They brought in a new chief executive. They thought the chief executive was wonderful. He, for 2 years, went on a massive acquisitions spree. And he bought and sold over 200 companies in 2 years. And nobody seemed to be able to control him or even ask strategic questions of what he was doing. And in the end, the whole thing, surprisingly, or unsurprisingly rather, blew up. And he was thrown out, and they spent years trying to resurrect the business, which had been a very strong German manufacturing business. But it was terrible because the chief executive teamed up or had a very strong operations team, and they just took over really and ran the thing, but without any helicopter view of what was going on. They were just buying and selling trading companies, and unfortunately wrecking their history in the process. So I don't think that's a very satisfactory answer to your question. Would you like to come back to me with a question?
Sure. I was about to ask Ulrich if he also had a follow-up question, but I think something that he really hit on to Professor Garratt, and something that we have not truly addressed yet at CCGI, is that as much as we are speaking to directors about the importance of understanding the breadth of their duties and becoming more competent and contributing to the organization, we have not dealt with management team who may push back because they are happier with a rubber stamp board.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. Well, wouldn't you be if you were a management team? I mean, of course, I'll be delighted.
Yes, yeah.
Just see them as what was the wonderful quote from Michael Lord Grade, who said, I used to see boards as B-days. Nobody knew what they were for, but they were very nice to have, classy to have.
Okay. Ulrich, did you want to ask a follow-up question?
No, I'm very comfortable. I think the way that the professor put it, and he put it quite squarely back on liability. And once you understood that, I think the rest kind of fell in place. So thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you. Good question.
Yes. Okay, lovely. So I see Dorelan has her hand up now. Dorelan, I invite you to unmute and also put on your video if it is that you are able to, so we can have you join us here in the panel screen as well.
Thank you, Kamala. Good morning, Professor Garratt.
Hi.
Other participants. Professor, in light of your proposal to have the shareholders' supremacy go out, would be suppressed, my question is, how do you follow the money in terms of AML, the need to report on AML issues? And I'm asking this because I think the reason why we are now asked to ensure that the beneficial owners are shown on annual returns, etc. Once that is provided for, and we must do it under our Form 45, how do we follow the money where we suppress the shareholders, their supremacy?
Right. I wasn't suggesting we suppress the shareholders. What I was suggesting was that the concept of shareholder supremacy, which had been developed out of Chicago, really from about 40 years ago, was never really valid. Because shareholders often did not have that amount of power, but it comes back to the previous question, chief executives did, but it was a useful cover. In terms of following the money, I totally agree with you. But the share registers are getting much better. Part of what my side comment there was much more related to London and New York than the Caribbean, which was that by creating the legal entity of a limited liability partnership, you did not, under that law, you did not have to declare the beneficial owners. And that has been, I would argue, a fundamental fault in trying to deal with AML. Because if you can't find who the owners are, they can just keep changing companies, which they do, registering and re-registering companies all over the place. And nobody can in the end say, look, this individual or this corporation is the beneficial owner of this. That's where I'm very frustrated in that area at the moment. Because I think actually, but it's also an area where I suspect, I more than suspect, I know the Caribbean is actually trying to tidy up its own act in a much better way, for example, than London is at the moment. Much better way that you are trying. And I'm speaking fairly recently with friends in Jamaica who are really trying to push through new laws that make this much clearer and much harder for people to avoid beneficial ownership. But it's work in progress. It's not finished. It's not clear. But I believe there are sufficient people around now to do this. And again, if you go back to Mia Mottley's speech yesterday, the implications behind that are not only that the West owes the islands and other parts of the world large reparations for the environmental damage they've done, but also they need to begin to tidy up their act so that your economies and your environments and your community development work are actually bounded by solid finances, not these airy-fairy ones that are around at the moment.
Thank you very much, Professor Garratt.
Thank you, Dorilan. I also want to thank Ulrich and Crystal, who engaged with us in this part of the Q&A session. We are heading to the top of the hour now, which would be noon here in Trinidad and Tobago. And so we can bring this first part of today's session to a close. I see that Ileana Salas has joined us. Hi, Ileana. So,
hello, Professor Garratt.
Hi, how are you? Good to see you.
I'm very well. Thank you. Likewise.
yes.
I enjoyed a very interesting discussion.
Okay.
Thank you, Ileana. So, just to share with everyone, Ileana will be doing the next presentation in today's global conference. And she will focus a lot more on the circular economy and the many changes that we are expecting directors to consider, even as they grapple with management, in how do we direct organizations so that it takes into account a lot of those issues which Professor Garratt raised for us this morning. So it promises to be very interesting as we continue. I know that Professor Garratt will be able to stay on with us for most of today, praying that the weather in London will continue to hold up well, so he is able to remain with good internet connectivity with us, which is going to allow him to be available if there are questions and comments later on as well that persons want to address to him. All right. So
well, I want to hear Ileana because she's got good stuff to say.
Oh yeah, she's absolutely amazing.
Thank you. I'm very humbled by those words. Thank you very much for the,
so are we taking
opportunity.
A break now?